The gold coins rattled loudly in the freezing rain. Prince Geoffrey smiled, handing the heavy sack to the ruthless Eastern slaver. "Take her far from this kingdom," the prince whispered, watching the heavy iron doors slam shut. "Make sure my brother never sees her again." Geoffrey thought he was merely discarding a worthless servant girl to secure his own power. He had no idea Margaret was secretly carrying the Alpha King's unborn heir, and he never realized that when his brother returned from the war, the king would burn the entire continent to ashes to find her. The gold coins rattled loudly inside the heavy leather sack. Prince Geoffrey smiled as he weighed the fortune in his right hand. "She is yours now," Geoffrey said, his voice dripping with malice. "Take her far away from this kingdom and ensure she never returns." Margaret knelt in the freezing mud of the castle's outer courtyard. The autumn rains soaked through her thin woolen dress, making her shiver violently. She did not cry out or beg for mercy from the prince. She knew mercy did not exist in the greedy heart of King Robert's younger brother. Instead, she placed her bound hands protectively over her lower stomach. It was a small, instinctive movement that no one noticed in the darkness. Inside her womb, a fragile secret was growing day by day. She was carrying the child of King Robert, the absolute sovereign of the realm. But Robert was hundreds of miles away, fighting a brutal war on the southern borders. He had no idea his own brother had just sold his unborn heir for a chest of gold. The man who bought her was named Silas, a notorious trader from the eastern lands. Silas stepped forward, his heavy leather boots splashing in the dark puddles. He gripped Margaret's chin with his rough, calloused fingers and forced her to look up. "She is beautiful, Prince Geoffrey," Silas murmured, checking her face in the torchlight. "The lords in the east will pay a high price for a girl with eyes like hers." Geoffrey scoffed and turned his back to the cold rain. "I do not care what you do with her," the prince replied coldly. "Just make sure she disappears before my brother returns from the battlefield." Margaret swallowed the bitter taste of fear rising in her throat. She looked past the iron gates of the castle toward the dark, misty mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks, Robert was leading his army through the mud and blood. He was a giant of a man, fierce and undefeated, feared by every king in the world. His subjects called him the Alpha King because his authority was absolute and unquestioned. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, he had been the gentlest soul she had ever known. Margaret remembered the warmth of his large hands when he held her by the fireplace. She remembered the quiet promises he whispered into her hair when the rest of the castle slept. They had kept their love a secret to protect her from the political schemes of the court. Robert had intended to announce their marriage the very day he returned from the war. Now that beautiful future was crumbling into dust beneath the wagon wheels. Silas pulled hard on the rope tied around Margaret's slender wrists. "Get up, girl," the trader growled, yanking her to her feet. Margaret stumbled, her knees scraping against the sharp stones of the courtyard. She bit her lip to keep from screaming, thinking only of the tiny life inside her. She had to stay strong, no matter how much her body ached from the cold. If she fell, if she gave up, her baby would die with her in the wilderness. Silas dragged her toward a large black wooden wagon parked near the tree line. The wagon was covered with heavy canvas, hiding the misery of those trapped inside. Two heavily armed guards stood by the horses, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Geoffrey watched from the sheltered stone archway, counting the gold pieces one more time. He had always envied his older brother's strength, his crown, and his absolute power. Selling Margaret was the first step in Geoffrey's plan to steal the throne. He believed that without this girl, Robert would lose his emotional anchor and become reckless. But Geoffrey was blind to the true value of the woman he had just discarded. He did not know that Margaret was more than just a servant girl to the great king. She was the keeper of Robert's heart and the mother of his future lineage. Silas unlocked the heavy iron padlock on the back of the wooden wagon. He pushed Margaret inside, where the air was thick with the scent of damp straw and old sweat. She fell onto the rough wooden floor, her breath escaping her in a soft gasp. The heavy door slammed shut immediately, plunging her into total, terrifying darkness. A moment later, the loud click of the padlock signaled the end of her freedom. Outside, Silas shouted an order to his men, and the whip cracked against the horses. The wagon jolted forward, the wooden frame graining as it rolled over the muddy road. Margaret rolled onto her side, pulling her knees up toward her chest to stay warm. She could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of other captives hidden in the shadows of the wagon. No one spoke, as despair had already claimed the voices of everyone inside. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cold wood of the wagon wall. Every bump in the road took her further away from the stone castle she had called home. Every second brought her closer to a life of unknown cruelty in the distant east. She closed her eyes and visualized Robert's face, focusing on the memory of his dark, fierce eyes. "Please come back alive, Robert," she whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling. "Please find us before it is too late." Meanwhile, back in the castle, Prince Geoffrey walked up the grand stone staircase. He carried the heavy bag of gold directly into the king's private solar. He sat in Robert's high-backed oak chair and poured himself a goblet of expensive red wine. Geoffrey took a slow sip, feeling the warmth of the alcohol spread through his chest. He looked at the empty room and smiled, believing he had successfully cleaned away his brother's weakness. The servants would be told that Margaret had simply packed her things and fled in the night. When the king returned, he would find a cold, empty bed and a heartbroken kingdom. Geoffrey believed a broken king would be easy to overthrow or manipulate. He did not understand the true nature of the brother he was trying to betray. Robert was not a man who broke under sorrow. He was a man who burned with vengeance. If the Alpha King discovered the truth, no ocean of gold could save Geoffrey from his wrath. Miles away, the dark wagon continued its slow journey through the pouring rain. The road drove rougher as they left the royal lands and entered the lawless border territories. Margaret held her breath every time the wagon tilted violently in the deep mud. She protected her stomach with both arms, shielding her unborn child from the harsh impacts. The physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. She wondered if Robert was looking at the same stormy sky at this very moment. She wondered if he could feel the sudden void left in the world by her disappearance. The child inside her stirred slightly, a tiny warmth in the middle of the freezing night. That small sensation filled Margaret with a sudden, fierce wave of determination. She would not allow herself to die in a foreign land as a nameless slave. She would survive the hunger, the cold, and the cruelty of the slave markets. She would live long enough to see the Alpha King ride across the horizon to claim his retribution. The wagon climbed higher into the mountain pass, leaving the kingdom completely behind. The rain turned into a light, freezing snow that dusted the tops of the pine trees. Inside the dark enclosure, Margaret kept her eyes open, staring into the blackness. She began to count the heartbeats of her child, using the rhythm to fight off the temptation of sleep. She knew that in this extreme cold, falling asleep could mean never waking up again. She had to stay awake to keep the blood flowing through her freezing limbs. She had to stay alive for the king who loved her and the child who depended on her. The long night wore on, and the steady turning of the wheels became her only reality. The Alpha King's brother had his gold, but he had also set a terrible destiny in motion. The journey had begun, and the secrets buried in the dark wagon would change the kingdom forever. The wooden wheels of the wagon ground relentlessly over the frozen mountain trails. The light snow of the early evening had quickly transformed into a howling, brutal blizzard. Fierce winds whipped through the loose gaps in the heavy canvas cover, bringing sharp bites of frost into the dark space. Margaret's teeth chattered uncontrollably as the temperature inside the wagon continued to plummet. The oppressive darkness made the bitter cold feel almost like a physical, malevolent weight pressing down on her chest. She wrapped her arms tightly around her torso, trying to trap whatever small amount of body heat she had left. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the warm hearths of the castle and the heavy fur cloaks of the king. She forced those memories away, knowing that dwelling on the past would only make the present agony harder to endure. Survival required absolute focus on the harsh reality of the wooden floorboards beneath her. Suddenly, a faint, ragged sound broke through the steady howling of the mountain wind. Margaret held her breath and strained her ears to listen into the pitch-black shadows. It was the sound of a shallow, uneven cough, followed by a quiet whimper of distress. She carefully pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, the coarse wood scraping her palms. "Is someone there?" Margaret whispered, her voice dry and trembling in the freezing air. No one answered, but the soft whimpering continued from the furthest corner of the moving cage. Margaret crawled slowly toward the sound, feeling her way through the darkness with outstretched fingers. Her hands brushed against cold canvas, damp straw, and finally, a small, shivering bundle on the floor. It was a child. Margaret's heart ached instantly as her fingers traced the outline of thin, fragile shoulders covered in rags. "Do not be afraid," Margaret said softly, lowering her voice to a gentle, comforting murmur. She moved closer and realized the child was a little girl, no older than 7 or 8. The girl's small body was completely stiff, trembling so violently that the floorboards vibrated beneath them. Margaret carefully reached down to touch the girl's legs, intending to rub some warmth into her limbs. She gasped quietly when she felt the unnatural, twisted shape of the girl's right calf and ankle. The child was crippled, forced to drag herself through life long before she was thrown into this slaver's wagon. "My name is Margaret," she whispered, gently brushing a knot of frozen hair away from the girl's face. "What is your name, little one?" "Clara," the girl breathed out, her voice so weak it was barely audible over the rattling wheels. "I am so cold, Lady Margaret," Clara whimpered, her tiny fingers clutching blindly at Margaret's wet woolen dress. "I cannot feel my feet anymore." Margaret knew the terrible danger of that statement in this desolate, freezing mountain pass. When the pain of the cold folded into numbness, the eternal sleep of death was closely following. Margaret did not hesitate, ignoring the exhaustion and the freezing ache in her own bones. She pulled Clara close, dragging the frail girl into her lap and wrapping her arms tightly around the child's shoulders. Margaret then took the bottom hem of her long woolen skirt and tore it upward with a sharp, forceful pull. She wrapped the torn, dry layers of the thick fabric securely around Clara's bare, twisted legs. "You must stay awake, Clara," Margaret instructed firmly, pressing the girl's freezing cheek against her own neck. "If you fall asleep now, the frost will take you away, and I cannot let that happen." Clara leaned heavily against Margaret's chest, her tiny frame seeking the desperate refuge of human warmth. "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked, her voice shaking with confusion and exhaustion. "The guards hit me when I cried," the girl whispered. "Everyone else just moves away." Margaret felt a sharp sting of tears behind her eyes, but she blinked them away into the darkness. "Because the world is already cruel enough, Clara," Margaret replied, resting her chin on the top of the girl's head. "We do not have to be cruel to each other just because we are suffering." Margaret shifted her weight, making sure her own stomach was shielded while still providing maximum warmth to the child. The unborn heir of the Alpha King rested to just inches away from the frail, discarded orphan of the streets. In that freezing wagon, stripped of all titles and gold, they were entirely equal in their struggle to survive. Margaret began to rub Clara's arms vigorously, generating a small friction to keep the girl's blood moving. To keep the child awake, Margaret knew she needed to distract her mind from the biting frost. "Let me tell you a story, Clara," Margaret said softly, her voice steady and rhythmic against the roaring wind. "I will tell you about a great warrior from the West, a giant of a man who wears a crown of iron." Clara stopped whimpering for a moment, her small ears catching the steady, calming tone of Margaret's voice. "Is he a monster?" Clara asked weakly, her breathing shallow but steady. "Some people think he is," Margaret smiled sadly into the dark, "because he destroys his enemies without mercy. But to the people he loves, he is a mountain that shields them from the storm." Margaret closed her eyes, letting the image of Robert's fierce, unyielding face fill her mind. She described the high stone walls of a fortress, the massive roaring fires in the great hall, and the smell of roasting meats. She painted a picture of warmth and safety, using words to build a sanctuary in the middle of a freezing nightmare. Clara listened in silence, her violent shiverings slowly subsiding as she absorbed Margaret's body heat. The little girl's breathing deepened, falling into a more natural, rhythmic pattern. Margaret continued to speak for hours, her throat growing dry and raw in the icy air. She refused to stop, knowing her voice was the only tether keeping Clara anchored to the living world. As dawn slowly approached, the intense snowstorm outside finally began to quiet down. A thin, gray sliver of morning light pierced through a tear in the wagon's canvas roof. The dim illumination revealed the bleak reality of their moving prison. There were 3 other captives in the wagon, huddled far away in the opposite corner. They stared at Margaret and Clara with hollow, defeated eyes, having surrendered to their fate long ago. Margaret ignored their stares and looked down at the child resting in her arms. Clara was pale and covered in dirt, her face gaunt from weeks of starvation, but the girl was breathing steadily, and a faint color had returned to her lips. Margaret felt a profound sense of purpose wash over her weary soul. She gently placed a hand over her own womb, feeling a silent promise forging in her heart. She would not just survive this journey for the sake of the king's unborn heir. She would survive to protect this broken child who had been abandoned by the world. When the wagon suddenly lurched to a violent halt, Margaret immediately tightened her grip on Clara. Heavy boots crunched against the fresh snow outside, and malevolent voices echoed near the wooden doors. The iron padlock rattled loudly, sending a wave of fresh terror through the dark enclosure. Silas, the slave trader, was about to open the gates to their next nightmare. Margaret raised her chin in the dim light, her eyes hardening with quiet, unyielding resolve. She had endured the long night, and she was ready to face whatever came with the morning sun. The heavy iron doors of the wagons swung open with a deafening screech. Blinding white winter sunlight flooded the cramped, foul-smelling space, forcing the captives to shield their eyes. Margaret sipped against the harsh glare, keeping one arm firmly wrapped around Clara's frail shoulders. They had arrived at a desolate border outpost, a grim collection of stone huts surrounded by frozen pines. "Out, all of you! Get out!" Silas barked, his breath forming thick white clouds in the freezing air. He did not raise a hand against them, merely standing aside as his armed guards herded the prisoners toward a snow-cleared yard. Margaret stood up slowly, her stiff joints aching from the terrible cold of the wooden floorboards. She looked down at Clara, noting how the little girl struggled to put any weight on her twisted right leg. Without a word, Margaret bent down and lifted the child into her arms. Clara gasped softly in surprise, instinctively wrapping her thin arms around Margaret's neck. "I am too heavy, Lady Margaret," Clara whispered, her voice filled with a heartbreaking sense of guilt. "I will slow you down." "Nonsense," Margaret replied evenly, her breath catching slightly under the added weight. "You weigh no more than a winter sparrow." She stepped down from the wagon, her worn leather shoes sinking deep into the icy mud of the courtyard. The biting wind immediately cut through her damp clothes, but the physical exertion of carrying the child provided a desperate kind of warmth. Silas directed the captives toward a wooden trough, where meager rations of hard bread and a bucket of half-frozen water awaited them. Margaret secured a piece of the stale crust and a small wooden cup of water, retreating to the shelter of a stone wall. She broke the tough bread into tiny, manageable pieces, feeding them to Clara first. The child ate with ravenous desperation, though she tried hard to save half for her protector. "Eat it all, Clara," Margaret commanded softly, pushing the remaining crumbs back toward the girl. "My body is strong enough to endure this day, but you must rebuild your strength." Margaret rested her hand instinctively over her own stomach, silently apologizing to the unborn child within. She knew the heir of the Alpha King was demanding nourishment, but the fragile girl in front of her would perish without immediate sustenance. In the shadow of the stone wall, surrounded by the bleakness of the borderlands, a profound bond was quietly cementing itself. Margaret was no longer just surviving for the king's return. She had become the absolute guardian of this discarded orphan. Hundreds of miles away, the heavy iron gates of the royal capital groaned open to welcome the victorious army. King Robert rode at the head of the column, a towering, imposing figure mounted on a massive black war horse. His armor was dented and scorched, bearing the grim evidence of a brutal, unyielding campaign in the south. Despite his exhaustion, a rare, faint glimmer of anticipation burned in the depths of his dark eyes. The war was won. The southern lords were crushed, and he was finally coming home to the woman who held his soul. The entire castle staff had gathered in the courtyard, bowing deeply as the sovereign dismounted. Prince Geoffrey stepped forward, his face carefully arranged into a mask of solemn respect. "Welcome home, brother," Geoffrey said, bowing his head. "The kingdom rejoices at your triumph." Robert merely nodded, his sharp gaze sweeping over the assembled servants and courtiers. His eyes searched the crowd for a specific face, a gentle presence that always waited near the arched doorways. Margaret was nowhere to be seen. A sudden, inexplicable chill settled over the king's broad shoulders, far colder than the winter winds of the border. He handed the reins of his horse to a stable boy and walked directly toward his younger brother. "Where is she?" Robert asked, his voice a low, thunderous rumble that commanded absolute truth. Geoffrey kept his eyes fixed on the stone paving, maintaining his carefully constructed lie. "She is gone, Your Grace," Geoffrey replied softly, feigning sorrow. "She fled the castle in the dead of night, nearly a fortnight ago." Robert stopped entirely, his massive frame turning deadly still. The courtyard fell into a suffocating silence, the air suddenly thick with a heavy, oppressive tension. "Fled?" Robert repeated, the single word echoing off the high stone walls with dangerous quietness. "Yes, brother," Geoffrey continued smoothly. "We found her chambers empty and some of her clothes missing. She left no word." Robert did not shout, nor did he draw the heavy steel broadsword resting at his hip. Instead, he bypassed Geoffrey completely and strode purposefully into the great keep. His heavy boots hammered against the stone floors as he bypassed the great hall and headed straight for the servants' quarters. He pushed open the heavy oak door of Margaret's small room, stepping into the cold, dusty space. The bed was neatly made, but the hearth was entirely dark, untouched by fire for many days. Robert walked slowly toward a small wooden chest sitting at the foot of the bed. He knelt and opened the lid, his large, scarred hands gently shifting through the folded garments inside. At the very bottom, carefully wrapped in a linen cloth, was a small, intricately carved wooden wolf. It was a secret token he had carved for her with his own hands, a symbol of his protection and love. Margaret would never have left that carving behind if she had gone willingly. She cherished it more than gold or jewels, keeping it hidden from the prying eyes of the court. The king slowly stood up, closing his large hand around the small wooden wolf. The lie his brother had spoken in the courtyard unraveled in an instant, exposing a dark, treacherous truth. She had not fled. She had been taken. And the only man in this fortress with the authority to dismiss the royal guards and remove a servant without a trace was Geoffrey. Robert closed his eyes and the exhausted soldier vanished, replaced entirely by the awakened sovereign. A terrifying aura of malevolent authority began to radiate from the king, plunging the small room into an invisible, suffocating pressure. When he opened his eyes again, they were completely devoid of warmth, reflecting only the desolate abyss of absolute wrath. He did not yet know where they had taken her, or what agonizing trials she was enduring in the freezing world outside. He did not know that his heir was growing in the darkness of a slave wagon, or that Margaret was shielding a crippled orphan with her own life. But he knew that someone had stolen the only light in his violent world, and he would reduce the entire continent to ashes to find her again. Robert turned and walked out of the room, the wooden wolf crushed tightly in his fist. The long, bloody retribution of the Alpha King had only just begun. The harsh winter wind howled across the wide, slow-moving river at the edge of the borderlands. Thick sheets of gray ice clung to the riverbanks, cracking and groaning under the pressure of the dark water. Margaret stood shivering on the muddy shore, holding Clara tightly against her chest. Silas had chartered a flat-bottomed ferry to carry his captives across the dangerous current. The wooden boat looked fragile and ancient, its timbers rotting and covered in slippery frost. "Move quickly," Silas commanded from the deck, his thick fur coat protecting him from the biting chill. "The water will freeze completely by nightfall, and I will not wait for stragglers." Margaret adjusted her grip on Clara, carefully stepping onto the unstable wooden boarding plank. The river wind was far more aggressive than the mountain breeze, slicing through her wet woolen dress like an invisible blade. She found a corner near the back of the ferry, shielding Clara from the direct blast of the freezing air. The deck was littered with frozen ropes and discarded cargo supplies. Margaret spotted a heavy, stiff piece of dirty canvas wedged beneath a wooden barrel. She pulled it free with her freezing, numb fingers, ignoring the foul smell of old fish and stagnant water. It was ugly and heavy, but to Margaret, it was a priceless shield against the winter storm. She draped the canvas over Clara, creating a small, insulated tent to trap their combined body heat. "Is that better, little one?" Margaret asked, her lips blue and trembling. Clara nodded slowly from beneath the heavy fabric, her dark eyes looking up with profound gratitude. The little girl reached into the pocket of her torn rags with a shaking hand. She pulled out a small, smooth river stone, polished perfectly round by years of flowing water. "I found this in the mud before the bad men took me," Clara whispered, pressing the stone into Margaret's palm. "It is my only treasure. I want you to have it, Lady Margaret." Margaret closed her fingers around the worthless rock, feeling the immense weight of the child's offering. To a king, a smooth stone meant nothing, but to a starving orphan, it was her entire world. "Thank you, Clara," Margaret said softly, tucking the stone safely into the bodice of her dress. "I will keep it safe forever." Beneath the stone, she felt a sudden, distinct flutter against the wall of her stomach. The king's unborn child was moving, a silent reminder of the life she was fighting so desperately to preserve. Margaret leaned her head back against the damp wooden rail of the ferry. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the dark water carry her further away from everything she knew. Back in the royal capital, the atmosphere within the great hall was heavy and suffocating. King Robert sat motionless on his high iron throne, his broad shoulders casting a massive shadow across the stone floor. He had not bothered to change out of his dented, soot-stained battle armor. The great hearth fires had been lit, but the heat could not penetrate the terrifying coldness radiating from the sovereign. Prince Geoffrey stood in the center of the hall, flanked by two heavily armored royal guards. The prince tried to maintain a posture of dignity, but a bead of nervous sweat rolled down the side of his face. "You asked to see me, brother?" Geoffrey said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty chamber. Robert did not answer immediately. He slowly opened his right hand and let the small, carved wooden wolf fall from his fingers. The carving hit the polished stone floor with a sharp crack, bouncing twice before stopping near Geoffrey's leather boots. Geoffrey looked down at the wooden toy, the color instantly draining from his aristocratic face. "Margaret did not run away," Robert spoke finally, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that carried absolute menace. "She kept that carving hidden because it was a gift from me. She would never have left it behind." Geoffrey swallowed hard, taking a slow step backward as the king stood up from the iron throne. Robert was a giant, his physical presence so overwhelming that the air in the room felt suddenly scarce. He walked slowly down the stone steps, the heavy steel of his armor clanking with the promise of doom. "I will ask you only one time, Geoffrey," Robert said, stopping mere inches from his younger brother. "Who took her from my castle?" Geoffrey's mind raced, desperately searching for another lie, another political maneuver to save his skin. He looked up into Robert's dark eyes and realized with absolute certainty that his kingly authority was useless here. There was no mercy in those eyes, only the deep, silent promise of an agonizing execution. "Silas," Geoffrey choked out, his knees trembling under the sheer weight of Robert's gaze. "A trader from the eastern lands. He paid in gold. He took her east toward the border." Robert did not yell, nor did he strike his brother down where he stood. Violence would be a release, and Geoffrey did not deserve the mercy of a quick end. "Commander Thomas," Robert called out, not breaking eye contact with the traitorous prince. A tall, scarred knight stepped forward from the shadows of the pillars, bowing deeply. "Strip my brother of his title, his lands, and his velvet clothes," Robert ordered with chilling calm. "Throw him into the lowest cell of the dungeon. If I do not return with Margaret, leave him there in the dark until he starves." Geoffrey gasped, finally dropping to his knees on the cold stone. "Robert, please! I am your blood," the prince begged, grabbing at the edges of the king's heavy cape. The Alpha King kicked his brother's hands away with a slow, deliberate movement. "You are nothing to me," Robert replied coldly, curting his back on the pathetic display. He walked briskly toward the heavy wooden doors of the great hall, his mind already racing ahead to the eastern roads. "Commander, assemble 50 of our fastest riders," Robert commanded as he marched down the corridor. "Give them fresh horses, heavy winter cloaks, and provisions for a long pursuit. We do not stop to sleep, and we do not stop to eat until the eastern border is crossed." By the time the afternoon sun began to dip behind the western mountains, the royal courtyard was alive with the sound of iron horseshoes. The king mounted his massive black warhorse once more, ignoring the extreme exhaustion in his own muscles. He pulled his dark fur cloak tightly around his broad shoulders, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The traitor had been dealt with, but the real war, the war for his heart and his bloodline, was just beginning. He spurred his horse forward, leading the column of armored riders out through the heavy iron gates. The hunt for the slave trader, Silas, had officially commenced. And the Alpha King would bring the full, crushing weight of his empire down upon anyone who stood in his way. The flat-bottomed ferry struck the eastern shore with a heavy wooden thud. Margaret held Clara securely against her chest, as the sudden impact threw the other standing captives to their knees. They had successfully crossed the dark water, leaving the known borders of the royal kingdom entirely behind. This was the lawless Easenan territory, a vast expanse of dense black forests and unforgiving winter storms. Silas wasted no time, shouting harsh orders at his guards to herd the shivering prisoners off the deck. The captives were pushed toward a temporary encampment set up just beyond the frozen riverbank. It was a miserable collection of canvas tents and dying campfires, surrounded by deep, unbroken snow. Margaret stepped off the wooden ramp, her boots sinking deeply into the freezing ankle-high mud. She carried Clara without a single word of complaint, her arms aching from the sustained exertion. A heavy-set guard with a scarred face stepped directly into Margaret's path, holding a long wooden staff. He pointed the blunt end of the staff toward the little girl resting in Margaret's arms. "Put the cripple down," the guard grunted, his breath smelling of cheap ale and stale tobacco. "Silas says we are moving fast through the forest tomorrow. We do not carry dead weight." Margaret stopped walking, her exhausted body suddenly going perfectly still. She did not lower the child, nor did she look away from the guard's aggressive stare. "She goes where I go," Margaret said, her voice quiet but laced with an unyielding steel. "She cannot walk and she will slow us down," the guard sneered, stepping closer. "Leave her in the snow." Margaret tightened her grip on Clara, shielding the trembling child with her own shoulders. "Silas expects to sell me for a high price in eastern markets," Margaret replied smoothly, showing no fear. "If you leave this child to freeze, I will refuse to eat, and I will not survive the journey." The guard hesitated, knowing full well the heavy price Silas had paid for this particular woman in the West. He muttered a foul curse under his breath and stepped aside, unwilling to risk the traitor's wrath over a ruined prophet. Margaret exhaled a slow, shaky breath and carried Clara toward the largest canvas tent in the camp. Inside, the ground was covered in damp straw, offering very little insulation against the frozen earth beneath. Margaret found a quiet corner in the shadows, far away from the canvas flap, where the icy wind blew in. She sat down heavily, arranging her torn woolen skirt to cover Clara's twisted legs as best she could. "You were very brave, Lady Margaret," Clara whispered, her small hands clutching Margaret's damp sleeve. "Brave men fight with swords, Clara." Margaret smiled tiredly, resting her back against the tent pole. "Mothers fight with whatever they have left." The words slipped out naturally, settling into the freezing air with a profound, undeniable truth. Margaret rested one hand on her own stomach, feeling the quiet rhythm of her unborn child. She looked down at Clara's dirty, tear-stained face, realizing her heart had fully adopted this broken orphan. She would protect them both against the abyss, even if it cost her final breath. Meanwhile, a violent storm of iron and fury was tearing through the western roads. King Roderick rode at the front of his heavily armored column, pushing his massive black warhorse to its absolute limit. The 50 elite knights behind him rode in grim silence, enduring the freezing wind without a single complaint. They knew their sovereign was operating on pure, relentless vengeance. Robert had not slept, and he had refused to stop for rations since they left the capital. His dark eyes constantly scanned the muddy roads, reading the broken branches and crushed snow like an open map. He was a conqueror who had crushed entire armies, yet all his supreme intellect was now focused on tracking a single wooden wagon. By nightfall, the royal riders reached the muddy banks of the western river crossing. The flat-bottomed ferry was gone, already moored on the distant shadowed shores of the east. Robert signaled for his men to halt, the sound of 50 armored horses coming to a sudden, disciplined stop. He dismounted slowly, his heavy boots crushing the frozen mud near the water's edge. The king knelt beside the deep tracks left by the slave trader's wagon. He removed his thick leather glove, pressing his bare fingers against the freezing earth to gauge the age of the prince. "They crossed here, Your Grace," Commander Thomas said, dismounting and standing a respectful distance behind his king. "The ice is too thin for the horses. We must ride 10 miles north to the stone bridge." Robert did not answer immediately, his sharp eyes catching a tiny anomaly in the frozen mud near the docks. He reached down and carefully pulled a small blue woolen thread from the sharp edge of a frozen rock. It was a piece of fabric torn violently from a hem, identical in color to the dress Margaret wore. Robert stood up, staring at the fragile piece of blue thread resting in his massive, scarred palm. He knew Margaret was a quiet woman, but she possessed a quiet resilience that mirrored his own brutal strength. She had intentionally torn her dress, perhaps to leave a mark, or perhaps to bind a wound. The thought of her bleeding or freezing in the dark sent a terrifying surge of malevolent energy through the king's chest. 10 miles is too far," Robert said, his voice echoing over the rushing water with absolute authority. "The eastern woods are vast. If they disappear into the deep timber, we lose them." "But sire, the river," Commander Thomas began, his voice laced with genuine concern for the horses. "We do not ride around," Robert interrupted, turning to face his seasoned commander. "We wait for the deep night. When the temperature drops and the surface freezes solid, we cross the ice." It was a reckless, suicidal command for heavily armored men, but not a single knight voiced an objection. They looked at the Alpha King, seeing the unwavering, terrifying dedication in his posture. He was a sovereign, willing to march his army directly into the frozen abyss for the sake of one woman. Robert turned his gaze back across the dark, rushing river, toward the unseen eastern shore. "Hold on just a little longer, Margaret," he whispered to the wind, his hand crushing the blue thread tightly. "I am coming to burn this world down for you." The midnight temperature in the eastern forest plummeted to a deadly, unforgiving low. Inside the miserable canvas tent, the damp straw offered zero protection against the frozen earth. Margaret curled her body into a tight, protective crescent, completely shielding Clara from the icy draft. The crippled girl was shivering less now, her breathing slow and exhausted against Margaret's collarbone. Margaret knew this stillness was dangerous, a deceptive calm that preceded the final freezing sleep. "Clara," Margaret whispered, her voice dry and hoarse in the bitter darkness. "Tell me about the river stone again." Clara stirred weakly, her small fingers reaching up to touch the fabric over Margaret's chest. "It is smooth. Because the water never stops fighting it," the child mumbled, her eyes heavy with profound exhaustion. "Exactly," Margaret replied, rubbing Clara's thin arms to keep the blood flowing. "The water never stops, and neither do we." Deep within her womb, her unborn child delivered a strong, sudden movement against her side. It was as if the royal bloodline was agreeing with her defiance, refusing to quietly fade into the abyss. Margaret rested her chin against Clara's tangled hair, staring blindly into the blackness of the tent. She was just a common servant in the West, but here in the freezing dark, she was a sovereign of survival. Miles away, the roaring river had finally surrendered to the crushing weight of the winter night. The turbulent dark water was now entombed beneath a thick, unstable sheet of groaning ice. King Robert stood at the muddy bank, his massive black warhorse exhaling thick plumes of white vapor. He did not wait for his commanders to test the treacherous crossing. The Alpha King spurred his heavy steed forward, his steel armor clanking in the dead silence. The ice shrieked loudly under the immense weight of the armored sovereign and his mount. Deep, spiderweb cracks shot out across the frozen surface, glowing faintly under the pale moonlight. Commander Thomas held his breath, watching his king walk the very edge of an icy grave. But Robert did not rush, nor did he show a single ounce of hesitation or fear. His dark eyes remained fixed on the eastern shore, his willpower entirely focused on closing the distance to his stolen love. One by one, the 50 elite knights followed their king into the freezing void. They moved in a staggered, cautious formation, trusting the absolute conviction of the man leading them. It took nearly an hour of agonizing, silent tension to cross the frozen expanse. When Robert's horse finally struck the solid mud of the eastern bank, a heavy, collective exhale escaped the knights. The sovereign immediately dismounted, ignoring the freezing wind that tore at his heavy fur cloak. He drew his steel broadsword, the heavy blade sliding from its scabbard with a sharp, deadly hiss. The royal hunters moved swiftly through the dark tree line, following the chaotic ruts left by Silas's heavy wagon. Within an hour, they breached the perimeter of a clearing. It was the temporary slaver encampment, but the canvas tents had already been struck down and removed. Silas had forced his captives to march long before the dawn, fleeing the incoming blizzard. Robert walked slowly into the center of the abandoned camp, his sharp eyes reading the tragedy left behind in the snow. He found the exact spot where the largest tent had stood, the ground still slightly compacted. He knelt in the frozen mud, pulling off his heavy iron gauntlet. He pressed his bare hand against the earth, finding a small, concentrated patch of melted frost. It was the faint, lingering warmth of two bodies that had huddled together desperately for survival. Robert closed his eyes, his immense chest rising and falling with a slow, terrifying rhythm. He could almost feel Margaret's suffering, her quiet endurance echoing through the freezing desolation. When the king opened his eyes again, the final shred of his political restraint had been locked away. "They are moving toward the mountain pass," Robert growled, standing up and mounting his warhorse in one fluid motion. "No more resting, no more caution. We ride until we catch them, and we leave no slaver breathing." The armored columns surged forward into the Black Forest, an unstoppable avalanche of steel and retribution. The eastern mountain pass was a jagged scar carved through the ancient black rocks. Heavy snow fell relentlessly, burying the narrow trail in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. Margaret stumbled forward, her breathing ragged and shallow in the freezing altitude. She held Clara tightly to her chest, refusing to let the crippled girl touch the lethal snow. Every step was an agonizing battle against gravity, exhaustion, and the bitter wind. Silas marched near the front of the line, his heavy boots kicking up sprays of frost. The slaver kept glancing over his shoulder, a deep, unsettling paranoia gnawing at his mind. The forest behind them had grown unnervingly quiet, completely devoid of the usual morning bird calls. It was a profound, suffocating silence that usually preceded a devastating avalanche. "Move faster," Silas barked his guards, his voice edged with a sudden, unexplainable panic. "Whip the horses. We must reach the summit before the sun peaks." A guard raised his heavy leather crop, striking the exhausted draft horses pulling the supply wagon. Margaret ignored the shouting, focusing entirely on the rhythmic thumping of her own heartbeat. She had stopped feeling her toes hours ago, trusting only her absolute willpower to keep her legs moving. Clara rested her head against Margaret's shoulder, her small eyes half closed but still watching the trail. "Lady Margaret," Clara whispered, her voice barely carrying over the howling wind. "The ground is shaking." Margaret paused for a fraction of a second, pressing her worn leather boot firmly into the packed snow. She could feel it too, a faint, rhythmic vibration echoing through the solid bedrock of the mountain. It was not an earthquake, nor was it the shifting of the heavy snowpack above them. It was the synchronized, terrifying thunder of heavy iron horseshoes striking the frozen earth. Silas froze in his tracks, the color draining instantly from his weathered, cruel face. He turned fully toward the tree line they had just left, his eyes widening in absolute horror. From the dense shadows of the black pines, a massive figure emerged into the blinding white snow. King Robert rode his colossal warhorse out of the tree line, a towering silhouette of dark steel and sovereign wrath. 50 elite, heavily armored knights filed out behind him, forming an impenetrable wall of lethal retribution. They did not shout battle cries, nor did they blow the royal horns of war. The silence of the royal cavalry was infinitely more terrifying than any scream. They were not here to conquer a rival army. They were here to execute an extermination. Margaret turned her head, her exhausted eye locking onto the giant figure mounted at the front of the vanguard. Even from a distance, even through the blinding snow, she immediately recognized the broad shoulders of the man she loved. A sudden, overwhelming wave of warmth flooded her freezing chest, chasing away the bitter frost. He had not abandoned her. He had crossed the frozen abyss, defying the wrath of winter itself to find her. Margaret sank slowly to her knees in the deep snow, finally allowing her exhausted muscles to rest. She cradled Clara securely in her lap, using her own body to shield the child from the imminent violence. "Close your eyes, Clara," Margaret instructed softly, pressing the girl's face against her collarbone. "The storm has finally arrived, and the monsters are about to be swept away." Silas drew his curved steel blade, his hands trembling violently as he realized the catastrophic mistake he had made. He had thought he was merely transporting a discarded servant girl from the Western courts. He never imagined that his cargo was the most guarded treasure of the Alpha King. "Defensive line!" Silas screamed at his mercenaries, his voice cracking with pure terror. The heavily armed guards drew their weapons, forming a desperate ring around the supply wagon, but their cheap swords and wooden shields were entirely useless against the impending avalanche of royal steel. King Robert did not break his terrifying gaze away from the slaver. He drew his massive broadsword, the dark metal catching the bleak winter light with a lethal glint. With a single silent motion of his armored hand, the sovereign unleashed his fury. The 50 elite knights charged forward, their heavy lances lowered, a flawless wave of unstoppable annihilation. Robert kicked his warhorse into a ferocious gallop, leading the descent directly into the heart of the enemy. The ground erupted under the weight of the charge, the snow violently kicked up into a blinding white mist. The era of Silas the Slaver was over. The era of absolute payback had begun. The clash of steel against wood echoed briefly, before being swallowed by the vastness of the mountain. There was no real battle, only a swift and absolute execution of sovereign justice. The elite knights swept through the mercenary perimeter like a devastating tidal wave. Men who had made their living selling the weak threw down their weapons in absolute terror. It did not save them from the crushing weight of the royal cavalry. King Robert bypassed the petty guards entirely, his dark eyes locked onto Silas. The slaver tried to run, his heavy boots slipping frantically in the deep snow. He did not make it 10 paces before the Alpha King's colossal warhorse cut off his escape. Robert swung his heavy steel boot, striking the slaver squarely in the chest. Silas collapsed into the snow, the breath driven completely from his lungs. The king did not bother to strike him with the broadsword. He simply signaled to his commander with a sharp tilt of his head. "Bind him in iron chains," Robert ordered coldly, his voice cutting through the howling wind. "He will face the judgment of the High Court when we return." With the enemy completely neutralized, a profound silence fell over the mountain pass. The storm of vengeance had passed, leaving only the quiet endurance of the winter landscape. Robert dismounted, his heavy boots crunching loudly in the packed snow. He dropped his massive broadsword carelessly to the ground, abandoning his weapon in the mud. The terrifying warlord vanished, replaced entirely by a desperate man seeking his soul. He walked toward the small, shivering figure huddled near the edge of the tree line. Margaret remained on her knees, her arms still wrapped fiercely around Clara. She looked up as the giant shadow of the king fell over her. Robert fell to his knees in the freezing snow, ignoring the bitter cold entirely. He reached out with a trembling, scarred hand, gently touching her pale cheek. "You are safe now," Robert whispered, his deep voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "I have found you." Margaret leaned into his large palm, a single tear escaping her eye and freezing on her skin. "I knew you would come," she replied softly, her voice barely a breath. Robert pulled off his heavy fur cloak, immediately draping the massive garment over her trembling shoulders. As he adjusted the thick fur, his eyes finally fell upon the small bundle hidden in her lap. Clara slowly opened her eyes, looking up at the towering, armored giant in absolute awe. The child had expected a monster, but she saw only a fierce protector. "Who is this?" Robert asked gently, his tone softening entirely. Margaret tightened her grip on the crippled girl, her chin lifting with quiet defiance. "Her name is Clara," Margaret stated firmly, "and she belongs to me now." Robert looked at the fragile, broken child, and then back at the unyielding determination in Margaret's eyes. He did not question the burden, nor did he hesitate for a single second. "Then she is under the protection of the crown," the king declared, extending his large hand to carefully brush the snow from Clara's hair. "No one will ever harm her again." He leaned forward to pull Margaret against his chest, wrapping his massive arms around her completely. As he pulled her close, his armored chest pressed gently against her stomach, Robert froze instantly, his sharp instincts picking up the subtle, undeniable shift in her body. He pulled back slightly, his dark eyes wide with a sudden, overwhelming realization. Margaret rested her hand over her womb, offering him a tired but incredibly beautiful smile. "Geoffrey, sold more than just a servant," she whispered, the truth finally breaking through the darkness. "He sold your heir." Robert stared at her, the gravity of her words crashing over him like a falling mountain. The absolute magnitude of what he had almost lost settled heavily into his soul. He had almost lost the woman who anchored his humanity, the child who carried his blood, and the fragile orphan who had tested their strength. He gently placed his large bare hand over hers, feeling the faint warmth of the life growing inside her. A terrifying mixture of profound love and residual fury surged through his veins. The world had tried to break his family, but the abyss had failed. Robert stood up slowly, lifting both Margaret and Clara effortlessly into his massive arms. "We are going home," the Alpha King announced, turning his back on the frozen desolation. The knights parted respectfully as their sovereign carried his reclaimed world back to the waiting horses. The long, agonizing nightmare was finally over. The journey back to the western capital was nothing like the agonizing march into the east. King Robert immediately summoned the heavy royal carriage, lined with the thickest furs and heated by iron coals. Margaret did not ride in the back with the cargo. She rode at the side of the sovereign. She held Clara on her lap the entire way, wrapped entirely in the king's massive winter cloak. Robert rode his black warhorse closely beside the carriage window, never letting them out of his sight. Every time Margaret looked out through the freezing snow, she found his dark eyes watching over her. The terrifying warlord had transformed into an impenetrable shield for his newfound family. When the massive iron gates of the royal capital finally groaned open, the entire kingdom was waiting. Word of the king's furious departure and triumphant return had spread through the stone corridors. The royal guards, the lords, and the servants all bowed deeply as the procession entered the courtyard. Robert dismounted his horse and walked directly to the carriage door. He did not wait for the footmen to assist the women. The sovereign opened the heavy wooden door himself, lifting Margaret and Clara together into his strong arms. He carried them up the grand stone steps, bypassing the formal greetings of the stunned court entirely. Margaret rested her head against his armor, listening to the steady, calm beating of his heart. She had left this castle as a discarded servant, dragged through the mud in the dead of night. She was returning as the most protected woman in the known world, held tightly against the chest of the absolute ruler. Robert carried them directly into his private solar, where a massive fire was already roaring in the hearth. He placed Margaret gently onto his own large velvet bed, surrounding her with warm, soft pillows. He then laid Clara down carefully on a thick bearskin rug right next to the comforting heat of the fire. "Summon the grand physician," Robert ordered a trembling servant at the door. "If this child's legs are not treated with the finest medicine we possess, heads will roll." The room was quickly filled with warmth, the smell of roasted meats, and the quiet, respectful murmurs of healers. Clara was bathed in warm water, dressed in soft, clean linens, and fed a rich broth. The little girl looked around the magnificent room, her dark eyes wide with disbelief. She clutched the small river stone in her hand, realizing she would never have to sleep in the freezing mud again. Margaret watched from the bed, feeling the deep, agonizing exhaustion finally leave her bones. Robert sat on the edge of the mattress, taking her pale hand in his massive, scarred fingers. He brought her knuckles to his lips, closing his eyes as he breathed in the scent of her skin. "You will never know the cold again, Margaret," the king vowed, his voice a low, heavy rumble. "I will build a fortress of fire around you, and no shadow will ever touch our bloodline." Later that evening, when Margaret and Clara had finally fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, Robert left the room. His heavy boots echoed loudly as he descended the spiral stone staircase into the lowest depths of the castle. The air grew damp and freezing, smelling of ancient stone and absolute despair. He stopped in front of a heavy iron door, guarded by two silent, unmoving knights. Robert gestured with his hand, and the heavy bolt was drawn back with a screeching metallic clack. Inside the pitch-black cell, Prince Geoffrey huddled in the corner, shivering violently in his thin linen shirt. The traitor squinted against the sudden light of the torches, his face gaunt and pale from days of terror. "Robert," Geoffrey croaked, crawling forward on his hands and knees. "Brother, please. I was a fool." The king looked down at the pathetic creature on the floor, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no rage left, only the cold, unyielding judgment of a sovereign who had secured his realm. "Margaret lives," Robert stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "She rests in my bed, carrying my heir and protecting the daughter we have adopted." Geoffrey's eyes widened, the realization of his monumental failure crushing whatever hope he had left. "She will be crowned queen before the winter ends," Robert continued slowly, "and you will remain here, in the dark, forgotten by the world and erased from the histories. You did not just betray a servant, Geoffrey. You tried to destroy my soul." Robert turned around, not waiting for his brother's desperate begging screams. "Seal the door," the king commanded the guards, "and never speak his name in my presence again." The heavy iron door slammed shut, plunging the traitor back into the eternal abyss he had tried to condemn Margaret to. The karma was absolute, quiet, and completely devastating. Months later, the harsh winter storms finally surrendered to the gentle warmth of the spring thaw. The eastern mountains were nothing more than a distant, fading memory. Inside the royal solar, the sunlight streamed through the high glass windows, illuminating the rich tapestries. Margaret sat in a heavily cushioned chair by the hearth, her face glowing with health and profound peace. She cradled a small, sleeping infant in her arms, the newborn prince wrapped in the finest western silk. Clara sat on the floor beside her, leaning her back against Margaret's knee. The girl's legs were still braced in polished wood and leather, but her cheeks were full, and her eyes were bright. She was reading a heavy leather-bound book, her small finger tracing the ancient letters. The heavy oak door opened, and King Robert stepped into the room, fresh from a meeting with his high lords. He stopped in the doorway, his broad shoulders relaxing completely at the sight before him. The terrifying conqueror vanished, leaving only a devoted father and a fiercely loving husband. He walked quietly across the room, kneeling down beside Clara to stroke her hair. He then leaned over Margaret, kissing her softly on the forehead, before looking down at his sleeping son. "The council was loud today," Robert murmured, his voice gentle and rumbling. "Let them shout," Margaret smiled, resting her free hand against his bearded cheek. "The world outside does not matter." Robert closed his eyes, leaning heavily into her touch. She was right. He had burned down the world to save the fragile light in his life, and from the ashes he had built a paradise. The Alpha King had finally found his absolute sanctuary, right here, in the quiet warmth of his family. This story really shows that true strength isn't about power. It's about choosing kindness in your darkest moments. If Margaret and the King's Journey moved you today, please hit that subscribe button. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, so drop your city in the comments. I'll be reading through all of them from here in Los Angeles. Also, what kind of story should we explore next? Leave your ideas below, and let's create the next one together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.